What does decolonizing global health mean for you?
Decolonizing global health for me means bringing together voices of the marginalized, forgotten, and lost to the table to affect change equitably and sustainably within global health.
For me, decolonizing global health means my research should align to the needs of local communities.
For me, decolonizing global health means a global movement that aims to deconstruct beliefs and perceptions of the world rooted in ideas of power and dominance of regions, countries, and groups when it comes to ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all.
For me, decolonizing global health means a social and class divide of equal access to healthcare throughout the world. It is another form of colonial rule, moving away from a geographical boundaries to a more capitalistic world, hence a need for health equity between the developed and developing country.
Decolonizing global health means breaking down the pedestals of the elites, equalizing the playing field, and building bridges between the global and the local.
Acknowledging the impacts of colonization and then, directly dismantling the systems of privilege and power that lead to health inequities, both within populations, but also between populations.
It's using every opportunity as a teaching, strengthening, capacity building opportunity.
For me, decolonizing global health means really a balance between fighting against the structural systems that perpetuate injustices and health inequalities, while at the same time humbling ourselves to listen and value local knowledge, expertise, and solutions.
There has been a noticeable increase in the number of individuals and institutions talking and writing about decolonizing global health. As you have just heard from my colleagues, if we are to achieve a global health that is truly about realizing the right to good health and well-being and to ensure equity whilst doing so, the scope of the change required is broad. From the structural to the individual, it will require action by the extraordinarily diverse range of stakeholders and actors that constitute global health. It will force us to reckon with systemic power imbalances and to privilege voices that are chronically underheard. UNU-IIGH is the UN's global health think tank. Over the past few years, we've been interrogating what it means to decolonize global health, both with respect to our work as an institution, be it in the way that we generate policy-relevant research, convene stakeholders, or deliver capacity strengthening programs, as well as in the sector more broadly. Initially, many of these conversations were internal or in closed fora, as we sought to piece together how we could be the change that we hope to see.
In this video series, we will feature conversations within our institute on our insights about decolonizing global health. We believe that being reflexive means having sincere conversations with our peers, with whom we could bounce off our ideas, exchange perspectives, and together chart a personal course of action towards making things better. In this first episode, we invite you to listen to a free-flowing conversation between myself and Emma as we look back at our stories in global health.
So whenever we have these discussions on decolonizing global health, we often talk about it at the international level, at the global level, as relationships between countries. When in fact I realize, drawing from my own experience and from your experience probably, that this is also reflected individually in the way we relate with people. In academia, for instance, if I'm a young PhD student who has a valid point and I speak up, oftentimes I think I'm ignored precisely because I'm just a student from the global south. When in fact somebody else says exactly the same thing, and that guy is probably white and a tenured professor, everybody listens. So even that asymmetry of power, that coloniality, that we speak of at the global level is very much evident in the way we treat with people in our relationships individually. So I guess if we want to decolonize global health, we also have to begin at the level of individuals. The way we
I mean, and I,
this.
I think that thing about individuals is a really important one, because it's not just how we treat other individuals at the table, but it's also how we internalize those power structures ourselves. So I'd mentioned that my personal threshold of burden of proof before I feel comfortable articulating something might be higher than the person's next to me. And then you have to ask yourself, well, why is that? Yes, partly it's because of training as scientists, and we want to be guided by the evidence, and you want to make sure that you're speaking from a place that is informed. But I think also it's partly it's a form of armor. It's a shield that I'm going to amass as much evidence as possible, so that whilst you may not value my opinion just because it's coming from me in the same way, if I can bolster that with evidence, then maybe you will take me more seriously, and maybe then my voice will start to have more weight. But then you have this inequity in that the amount of weight that I would need behind my decision or my contribution, the burden of proof is higher than if somebody who already has the power would not need to provide as much. They could just make a statement and everyone would be like, oh yeah, of course.
Yes, and everybody believes that person already because of the person's stature. Yeah, and you can explain this. You're thinking about it. You understand yourself, and you are aware of that when you say that for you it takes a high burden of evidence before you decide to take it on or speak about it. It may not be true for others. I have a feeling, or I suspect that for some people who don't even have that awareness, they
Yeah,
probably
and
don't think that way.
There's pros and cons. You can end up being your own biggest enemy, but I think that you can turn it to an advantage. So there's kind of two things, right? The first is recognizing. So it's reflecting and recognizing, and then you need to act on it. And there can be a disconnect between the recognizing and the doing. And I think the doing is even harder than the recognizing. Once you've reckoned with yourself and you've had an existential crisis, you've then got to do something about it. And that's partly yourself, and then that's partly the structures and the environment around you. So somebody may be thoughtful and reflective and they recognize the challenges, but if you're not in a supportive and enabling environment, those challenges may be more than you can surmount as an individual, which is why it's important that we have these conversations at different levels. It's about recognizing the role, the responsibilities, how much you can take on as an individual versus somebody who's managing a team. So how do you create an enabling environment for the people directly that you work with whether it's your team or whether it's partners, then as an organization, a group of organizations, and then, hopefully at a whole systems level. And I think it's the same with the decolonising conversations. It's something that everybody needs to buy into at both an individual and organizational level if we're really going to see meaningful change. But the second point that I kind of alluded to, I think, is then as we do this type of work where we are trying to challenge structural inequities, we have to reflect on ourselves as individuals, because you need to be ruthlessly honest with yourself about what biases you're bringing to the table and how those biases might influence or impact the way you perceive what you're reading, the way you perceive the way that others interact with you, and how defensive or open you might be to that input, who you think about when you think about who you'd be willing to partner with, what you think an acceptable solution looks like. All of these things are informed by what we bring with us. And then you need to be very intentional about what it is that you're trying to achieve, and being able to reflect back and say, okay, this is where I was trying to get to, but did the outcome match? And it can't just be at the end of the process. It's got to be all the way through.
I guess that's why we're having this conversation. Because,
and that is exactly.
Yes, and we have these preconceived notions, unexamined view of the world. And like, for example, for someone like me who grew up in the global South, in a country like the Philippines, used to be Spanish and an American colony. I do think that we have this colonial mentality still very much prevalent in Philippine society. So much so that we always view the global north as something where the expertise is, where the solutions always come from, as a place where we all dream to go to pursue our education. And that has always been the view from where I am. So there's this prevailing mentality, uh, often unexamined. And so when we're having these conversations, it provides an opportunity for for people like you to help me challenge those assumptions, help me re-examine my view of the world, and try to trigger that paradigm shift, if you might call it that. And it starts with that. I think the awareness begins there. And before we even talk about going to the action, first it begins with the awareness at the personal level.
And I think that the challenging and the reflecting comes both ways, so equally you have asked me questions, some of which I know that I feel uncomfortable reflecting on too deeply, but that's the reason to do it, around my own heritage, so if you didn't see me, if we didn't have the video on and you just heard my voice, the assumption for many people is that I'm British, and then the default in their head is that British equals white. And that's obviously not the case. It's an immensely diverse country, but part of the reason it is so diverse, and that's without even thinking about kind of the heterogeneity of what it means to be white British, and the multiple invaders that came into the British company. It's because of the many countries that it colonized, and so myself as a body, as an individual, is representative of both my country's heritage as a colonizer, but also as a group of people who were not only colonized, but enslaved and shipped to the other side of the world. And so that's kind of really tricky to process at times, particularly when there are conversations not just in the health sector, but globally at the moment about Black Lives Matter and what that means, and allyship, and who gets to speak and who has a voice. It's an existential crisis, not just professionally, but personally as well, which is why I think it's important that we continue to have these conversations. And to ask you, as somebody who is from the Philippines but has been educated in part in the global north and has kind of followed the expected career path of a promising researcher from the global south, how your reflections on your own journey and what success looks like might have changed as you've embarked on this decolonizing process.
First, I have to say that I am sincerely thankful to the scholarship program that was given to me, which gave me the opportunity to do my PhD studies in Switzerland, which is, by the way, not a colonial power. But nevertheless, you know what? When I look back at my own graduate studies, I don't remember having vibrant conversations regarding decolonizing global health where I was for my PhD. So at one level, I think that's a sign that a lot of work has to be done in elevating the discussion and making sure that it becomes part of global health conversation all over the world, whether that's in the global north or the global south. So I'm not even sure if a significant number of schools already try to tackle the topic and include it in their curricula. Because even if there has been a recent surge in interest in decolonizing global health, you might agree with me that many of these are still concentrated in certain areas and in certain centers of power. Harvard, for example, or of course, we also recognize that it started in South Africa. But like in Asia, in Southeast Asia, I don't think that it is a prominent topic of discussion, at least in the region, when in fact Southeast Asia used to be a colony also of France, of Spain, of Portugal, of the Netherlands, and of the United Kingdom. But I remember that in the classroom, often the cases were about LMICs. So for example, there's a class on health financing, and we do a case study of universal health coverage in Kenya, or universal health coverage in Rwanda. And I guess in that situation, we can contribute because often LMICs share the same problems and share the same experiences. And so we can contribute to that discussion. On the other hand, when I think about it, it can also contribute to this prevailing misconception that the problems are only located in the global south, especially when all the cases you decide to discuss in the class about global health problems are cases from the global south. I never remember having a case where we discussed, let's say, the inefficiencies of the Swiss health system or the struggles of the NHS in the UK. So maybe that's one practical step to think about, that when we teach global health, whether that's in the global north or in the global south, when we think of case studies and we look for problems to solve, we should also try to study problems of the global north, just so we can contribute to this awareness that the problems are not solely with the global south, but they can also be with the global north, and people from the global south have something to contribute, have lessons to contribute to solving the problems of the global north.
There are multiple different perspectives. And so actually it's not one voice. The issue is not that we only want to hear one voice. It's about how the different voices are treated equitably and proportionally. And so what that means is not that I have to completely extricate myself from the space, but it's about this recognizing what you bring to the space, what you don't bring to the space, and what your particular role is, so that other people are able to bring their skill sets and knowledge and expertise to the table as well.
Unless we are able to, in a way, transform that kind of thinking, still prevalent in the global south, we will not be able to accelerate this movement towards decolonizing global health. So awareness is one, and this has also links with our discussions on accountability. So often when we talk about accountability for decolonizing global health, the usual assumption is that we make the global north accountable for their actions.
Yep.
When in fact, the accountability doesn't stop at the global north. Even the global south has to be accountable for contributing in a way to this colonial global health that we have and we're trying to change.
I mean, and the logical argument perhaps is that if you want a system that is more equitable, then that has to be applied across the board. And it includes the accountability and the governance and the responsibility taking. There is, the simplistic narrative is look at all these awful things that the global north has done to the global south. But we know that there is inequality within countries, not just between countries, and that when we talk about who might concede power or who has or who might lose, because often it does become a kind of zero-sum game, even though I don't think that is the reality of the situation. But the idea is if somebody is to gain, that somebody has to lose, and people in power within global countries in the global south may also be willing to concede some of the privileges that they have in order to have more equitable societies, to concede some of the power that they have in negotiations, bilateral negotiations with other countries that they would need to concede in order to make things more equitable, and that they would need to be held accountable. And I think there's a really interesting conversation about who is holding whom accountable, both within and between countries, and what those structures might look like.
As we initiate these conversations among ourselves in UNU-IIGH, we invite you as well to spark your own conversations wherever you may find yourselves in the global health space. Let us look back at our stories, share them with peers, exchange perspectives, transform our insights into action, and be part of this movement to transform global health.
The retreat of colonial powers from many, although by no means all, of their former colonies was just the first and most visible step of decolonisation. Coloniality of the mind, that is to say, internalized beliefs of patterns of power that continue to dictate whose knowledge is sought, whose culture is respected, and whose labour is valued, is much harder to see and thus to tackle. As such, this first episode has focused on the role of the individual and how our positionality affects the way we work within global health. Over the course of the series, we'll be joined by our IIGH colleagues as they reflect on what it could mean to decolonise different aspects of global health, including education, global health cooperation, funding, and policy. For now, we leave you with these two questions and hope that you'll join us next time. First, looking back at my experiences, in what ways did elements of injustice and privilege create the conditions that have brought me to where I am today? Second, how have my experiences, both personal and professional, influenced the way that I engage in global health?